Why do we believe what we believe? That's the question we've been asking ourselves for the past few weeks as we look at what the Bible has to say about some of the most important questions of our day. We've looked already at the belief in the existence of God, and the Bible is God's Word. And today we're going to talk about the belief that God is in control of the universe. As a jumping off place, we're going to read from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, Isaiah chapter 46. We're going to read verses 8 through 11. If you'd like to read along with me while you're turning to that passage, I'll tell you that the setting for this passage is that the nation of Israel has been conquered in battle. They are now, they've been carried off into exile in Babylon, so they're under the control of the Babylonians. There seems to be absolutely no way out for them, no way to change their circumstances. They don't have an army sufficient to conquer the Babylonians. They feel like God has forgotten them. And here God comes to them with a word to remember the former times. Remember what God has done in the past to assure them that he has a plan for their future. So let's read this. Isaiah chapter 46, verses 8 through 11. He writes, "Remember this and stand firm. Recall it to mind, you transgressors. Remember the former things of old. For I am God, and there is no other. I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times things not yet done, saying, my counsel shall stand, and I will accomplish all my purpose. Calling a bird of prey from the east, the man of my counsel from a far country. I have spoken, and I will bring it to pass. I have purposed, and I will do it." Back in the early 1960s, Mel Brooks and Carl Reiner used to do a skit together. It was called The 2,000-Year-Old Man. And the way it worked, Carl Reiner played a reporter, and Mel Brooks played a man who miraculously was still alive after 2,000 years. He was 2,000 years old, and Carl Reiner would interview him to find out what life was like 2,000 years ago. And in one of the parts of the routine, they got to talking about religion. And the 2,000-year-old man says, "Oh yes, we believe in the Lord." And the reporter asks him, "Well, have you always worshipped the Lord?" And he says, "Oh no. No, in fact, in our village, we used to worship a guy named Phil." And he says, you worshipped a man named Phil? And he says, "Absolutely." And he says, "Well, why?" And he said, "Well, Phil was the biggest, strongest guy in our village. And you just look at him and you knew how mean and tough he was. And he was big enough and strong enough that he could take you and tear you apart with his bare hands." And so the reporter asks him, "Well, how did it come about that you stopped worshiping Phil?" And he said, "Well, one day a big thunderstorm came up over our village, and a lightning bolt came down and struck Phil. We all gathered around as Phil lay there dead on the ground, and we looked at him, and then we all looked at each other and said, there's something bigger than Phil." And that's not a bad way to introduce this idea about what we call the sovereignty of God, that God is in control of the universe. There's something bigger than you and me in control of things. The one who, as we have seen, created the universe is still in control. That's what I'm going to try to show you today. Now, let me start off by saying, or talking about why people who don't believe this, why they don't believe it. As we've tried to build with each message upon the last, and we've talked about the existence of God and those who don't believe in God's existence. Obviously, one of the arguments against the thought that God is in control of the universe is, if you don't believe God exists, you don't believe he's in control, obviously. Atheists believe that something came from nothing, that everything you see around us just came about on its own, and there is no one in control. When I was a little boy, I loved the TV show Lost in Space. Any of you remember that? Loved that. It was on in the 60s. It was about a family in a spaceship hurtling through space in the distant year of 1997. There was a mom and a dad who was an astronaut. There was a 12-year-old boy named Will Robinson. There was an evil scientist who had hidden on the ship, and they didn't know he was there until they were already out in space. And there was a robot who used to alert Will Robinson to danger. The robot, and I jotted this down, was a Class M3, Model B9, non-theorizing environmental robot. And what they meant by non-theorizing was that he was non-judgmental, just what every 12-year-old boy wants for a friend. Somebody who's not going to judge him. Well, they were traveling in a universe in which no one was in control. And as I watched it as a young boy, it all seemed very innocent to me. I realize now that there was a message there, perhaps not a blatant message, but it was an insight into the mindset, to the philosophy of the people in Hollywood who were making TV shows. And that is that the universe is a lonely place, it's an empty place except for the other creatures that are out there. But there is no God in control of the universe, and when it comes to life, even out in space, you are on your own, hence the title, Lost in Space. Now, this gave way eventually to Star Trek and Star Wars, all of which kind of have the same philosophy about life. No one is in control. And I've noticed those, we talked about in the first sermon how there has been a decline in America and in the West in general in the belief in God, how there are more atheists in America now than at any time in our nation's history, and how the increase in our entertainment of this mindset that you're on your own, the world, the universe is an empty place, there's nobody out there watching over things, as we have, with less and less frequency, believed in God, we see more and more of that in our popular entertainment. G.K. Chesterton, who was an English Christian, he wrote this. He said, when a man stops believing in God, he doesn't then believe in nothing, he believes in anything. And notice, for example, I have a lot of conversations with atheists about this. To a person, so far, every single one I've spoken with who doesn't believe in God because they say there is no evidence for the belief in God or for his existence. To a person, without exception, every single one of them believes there is life on other planets. Now, there's no proof for that either. So far as we know, we are alone in the universe in terms of life on other planets. But to a person, every single one of them who has said to me, I don't believe in God because there's no proof of his existence, says, I do believe there is life on other planets. And when I say, well, what's the proof of that? They say, well, there just has to be. The universe is such a big place. There may be life on other planets. I have no idea. I do know that to believe in life on other planets takes the exact same leap of faith that belief in God requires. So that's one reason some people don't believe in God, or that God is in control. They don't believe he exists to begin with. The second reason is one that may concern us more as Christians, that we may understand more. And it's that people say, well, there's so many bad things that happen in life. How can God exist? They look at horrible diseases or war or famine or other evils that exist in the universe, and this then is proof that there cannot be anyone in control. So how do we as Christians explain the existence of evil in the world? And there are two answers. The first one is that the Bible teaches clearly that God gave us free will. And so that means that we get to choose what our lives are going to be like, but other people get to choose also. God could intervene. Let's say you're out driving down the highway and somebody, my wife and I were talking about this yesterday. You see all the people texting and reading their phones while they're driving? God could protect you from that person who's texting, but you would then lose free will. That person would lose free will. And so the question to ask yourself is, would you rather be a robot from whom God has removed all free will, all choices, all decisions, and he will just protect you every place you go? Or would you rather be a free person with free decisions, free will, but you will also be subject to the consequences of those choices and the choices that other people make. I would prefer the way God chose. I like having free will, even though I know that sometimes bad things result from it. So that's one reason. God gave us free will. The second is that there is sin in the world. There is sin in our hearts, sin in our lives, sin in the world. And a lot of the bad things we experience, not all, but a lot of them are the direct consequence of our own sin. Overeating, overdrinking, abuse of drugs, immorality of all kinds, and on and on and on. All of these things lead to the consequences that we suffer or that we inflict on other people. One of the first funerals that I conducted as a young minister, I was still in seminary. And there was a man in our church who passed away at the very young age of 42. I still remember. Now, this man was, there's no way for me to, there's no term for me to give you to describe his weight problem. So I'll just tell you, he was about 5'6", 5'7", and he weighed over 400 pounds. I'm not guessing his weight, his family told me that. Now, at his funeral, he died, as you might imagine, from a heart attack. At his funeral, someone from his family said to me, "How could God let this happen?" Well, the answer is, you eat to the point where you weigh over 400 pounds and you're 5'6", eventually your heart's going to get out. Now you can blame that on God if you want, but the choices were ours. The sin was ours. We did this. So yeah, there is free will, there is sin. That is the consequence of God saying, I'm going to let you make your own choices. The Bible says this, Galatians 6:7, "Be not deceived, God is not mocked, for whatsoever a man sows, that will he also reap." That is a principle of the Scripture. So what is the alternative to this view? Well, our view, of course, as Christians, is we believe that God not only created the world, but that he is in control of it. We call this the doctrine of the sovereignty of God. Sovereign, like a king or a queen is called a sovereign because they rule. And so, whereas atheists would say that everything came from nothing, as Christians we say everything came from God. Atheists say no one is in control of the universe and therefore life is meaningless. We say God is in control of the universe and everything is progressing according to his plan. Now the text that we read today, Israel in captivity in Babylon, they feel hopeless. There's no way they can change their circumstances. They don't see how anything is going to change, but God has a plan. And you notice he refers to his plan as a bird of prey from the east, and a cryptic and mysterious what he's saying there. Now later, Israel will see what God was talking about. This bird from the east turned out to be the king of another nation, Cyrus, who was the king of Persia. In a plan that no Israelite could ever have imagined or foreseen, because they were right when they said, we can't defeat the Babylonians. They've already defeated us. We're powerless against them. Therefore, we're stuck. There's no answer. But God had raised up a nation even more powerful than the Babylonians. And the Persians fought the Babylonians, conquered them, and Cyrus, the king of Persia, in a decision that stunned the Israelites, said, you know what? I'm going to let you go back home. And he freed the Israelites to go back to their nation. That was God's plan. In verse 9 of our text, God tells them to remember the things of old, how he had dealt with Israel in the past, the miracles in Egypt, the crossing of the Red Sea, deliverance from the Midianites and the Ammonites and the Philistines. All of it proved that God was God. Look at what he says in verse 9. I am God. And in the original it means I am the mighty one, the omnipotent God in all of his fullness. All of these titles he's giving to them were a reminder that God was in control. In verse 10 he talks here about the omniscience and the omnipotence of God. In other words, God knows everything. He sees everything. He can do everything. Look at what he says. He declares the end from the beginning. In other words, at the very beginning of something, God can already tell you how it's going to end because God already knows. He foretells accurately the course of future events, and he declares in verse 10 that his purpose and his design and his will stand. And as Christians, that's what our hope is based in, the expectation and the belief that God will ultimately be victorious over the powers of sin and darkness. And that's where our faith rests, in that unshakable belief that God is in control. Now, what do we say about the bad things that happen? We're not blind to that. We know that terrible things happen in life. But one of the things we believe, and we go to the New Testament for this insight, is that God can take even the bad things in life and use them for our benefit and for his glory. Paul writes in Romans 8:28, we know that all things work together for good to them that love God, to them who are called according to his purpose. That is a scriptural promise that covers every aspect of life. Now let's take it just on a simple level, nothing deep or profound. If you do, say, the shopping for your meals, and then you go to the store, you go through the store, you buy the things you need, you come home, you put it all away, and then when it's time to cook, you take it back out, you prepare everything, you prepare a meal for your family. It's kind of a bother, it's a bit of a hassle, but you can do all of that joyously, joyfully. Why? Because you know that the end benefit will be that you are preparing a delicious, nutritious meal for your family. That's on a simple, small level. Another might be if you exercise, maybe you go to the gym or you go jogging or whatever. It's not necessarily fun in that you're putting your body through an ordeal. It can be grueling and all of that. But you know that in the end it's going to pay off, that something good is going to come from it. Better health, loss of weight, whatever. I can endure the pain of surgery if I know that the surgery is going to cure me of an illness or a disease or whatever. Now, spiritually, the same thing is true. We believe that God is working through all of the contingencies of life, all the things that can go wrong and sometimes do go wrong, because God has a plan and a purpose that we don't see yet, but God already sees it. It's already there. He says from the very beginning, I already know the end. I know how it's going to end up. And through every step along the way, we believe, because the Bible teaches us so, that God is at work, taking the good from life, the bad, mixing it all together, and making something wonderful. So when you're going through pain and difficulty and all of that, don't focus on the pain, focus on the outcome. And keep in mind that God is at work in all of it. Now look, I know sometimes it seems like life is out of control. Keep your focus on God. Not on the problems, not on the circumstances, not on the things you can't change. Stay focused on God and rest in the belief that he's in control and he's at work. When I was a seminary student, once a year they used to invite W.A. Criswell to come to speak in our chapel. Criswell, at the time, was pastor of First Baptist Church of Dallas, which was at that time the largest Baptist church in America. And probably outside of Billy Graham, he was the best known Baptist preacher in the world at the time. He's gone on to be with the Lord many years ago. But anyway, he would come preach every year in chapel. Always loved hearing him preach. Great preacher. One year he told a story that really stuck with me. He said that when he was a little boy, his mom liked to embroider. Do you remember? I don't know. Do people still embroider? Do women still do that? You know, you take that piece of cloth and I think there's like a wooden hoop or something, right? And he said one day he was crawling around on the ground and he looked up at what his mother was doing. Have you ever seen embroidery from the bottom side, by the way? It doesn't look like anything, does it? It looks like it's a mess. It's all jumbled. There seems to be no design to it. And he said, I'm sitting there looking at what she's been working on for hours, and it looked like the biggest mess I'd ever seen. And I said, Mom, what are you doing? And she said, you go on about your business, and when I'm finished, I'll call you back and let you see it from my side. And so he did. And when she finished, she called him back and she held it out to him. She said, now son, now look at it from my side. And he looked at it and he said it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. And his mother, who was a devout Christian, used that to teach him a lesson. She said, I know it looked like there was no plan, no purpose. It just looked like a mess. That's from your side. But from my side, from my perspective, I was working by a plan all along. There was a pattern to what I was doing. All along, I was working according to that plan. Now you can see what I was doing. Now I'll confess to you, because that's been, I don't know, 35 years ago, something like that. There have been many times in the intervening 30 years, 35 years, that I have just stopped and said, God, what on earth are you doing? I always go back and remember that. And I live with the absolute conviction that one day God is going to call me over, and it'll be in heaven, I'm sure. It won't happen until then, but he's going to call me over and say, no, Roger, this is what I was doing. You couldn't tell from